Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the RTX 4070 Super, more specifically it's the Palit JetStream OC version. It has an on-paper boost clock of 2640MHz, though I've seen it exceed 2800, often settling at 2835 in intensive gameplay scenarios. Thanks to the triple fan cooler, it hits these speeds while maintaining very respectable temperatures, as you'll soon see from the gameplay footage. I really like the all-black design, which is perfect for anyone looking to keep their PC case an RGB free zone. Speaking of PC case, it seems I underestimated the space inside mine. This is certainly more high-end than the cards I usually focus on here, but instead of pairing it with a top-tier CPU, I decided to stick it in my mid-range Ryzen 5 7500F system to see what we can expect at 1440p in 20 games. Now this was on top of my desk in a test bench during this gameplay footage, so you're going to see temperatures sitting at around 50 to 60 degrees, but when it was inside my case yesterday, a case that fit, it was sitting at around 60 to 67 most of the time, and it remained very quiet, but that's not surprising considering the size of this thing. So let's get into some titles. Now these games are in no particular order. I just thought I'd showcase 20 different games. Some of them are my favourites, some of them are slightly older, but they still look pretty good, and some of them are also quite CPU intensive, so that you can see how well a card like this pairs with a more modest processor like the 7500F, which is a 6-core part. Now first of all, we have the Outer Worlds Spacer's Choice Edition, which I was running at 1440p with the Ultra preset. I'm going to flash up the settings that I used for each game, but feel free to pause the video anytime and skip ahead if you wish to see a particular game in action, because they will all be time-stamped down below in the description and therefore in the video as well. So the Outer Worlds at 1440p with the Ultra preset here hit an average of 107 FPS with a 1% low of 73 and a 0.1% low of 48. As you know, Elden Ring is capped at 1440p. No, it's not. It's capped at 60 FPS. And here with the maximum preset with RT turned off, it managed to hit that frame rate cap. Enabling ray tracing meant that our average did drop by a few frames, so I decided to leave it off here to maintain that cap, and when it came to those percentile lows, things were very consistent as well. This looks really nice with these settings and runs just fine at 1440p. In fact, most of the recorded frame drops were when we were transitioning between different areas in the game, so that didn't happen very often considering I've been playing the same part for about a year. But in all seriousness, I've actually played more than this on the PS5. I have neglected the PC version a little bit. The Witcher 3 Next Gen, next at 1440p of course with the Ultra preset. The only thing I changed here was SSR or Screen Space Reflections, which I turned down to low, because this can absolutely decimate the frame rate when it's left at default or high. HBAO Plus was also on here for an average of 144 FPS. The 1% low was 93 and the 0.1% low was 78. So even in and around those busier and crowded areas, this system in combination still held up fairly well, and we were getting some very nice results. In fact, I was messing around with my i9 system a couple of days ago and this same card, and I found that while the averages didn't always change that much, it was the percentile lows that did increase when using a faster processor. So at 1440p, a card like the 4070 Super is going to be doing most of the work. Most of the stress is on the GPU, but a faster CPU will help maintain a little more consistency in some of those more processor demanding titles. Speaking of which, we have Cyberpunk 2077 up next at 1440p with the high preset. I should stop saying 1440p because all of the games were tested at this resolution. Nothing else was changed here, but I did turn the basic options off, which included chromatic aberration, film grain and all that, just as a personal preference. We saw 101 FPS on average with a very nice 1% low of 69 and a 0.1% low of 58. I took a drive over this bridge here into what is usually quite a processor intensive zone, and it was nice to see the Ryzen 5 holding up quite steady here. In pairing with the 4070 Super, it seems to be doing quite well, and I'd just like to remark how quiet this card is staying. It's an extremely quiet car to be fair, but I'd expect no less from this beefy Palit JetStream cooler. Can it run Crysis? Well, let's find out using the Can It Run Crysis graphical preset. Here, with the settings pretty much turned up or left as they are when selecting this preset and TAA enabled, we saw 87 frames per second on average. Now this was a little bit all over the place in terms of performance. Some areas hit over 100 FPS and others, like this beach zone here, could drop to around 57, 58. 58 was actually that 1% low. The 0.1% low was 43. I was surprised to see this one doing a little worse than I expected, but I guess, can it run Crysis? Well, the meme lives on. Years ago it was the original game, and even though this remastered version is a few years old now, it can still bring modern hardware to its knees in some areas. Next up we have Red Dead Redemption 2, which is far more GPU intensive than it is CPU intensive. Ultra textures here, everything else was set to high, and TAA was also enabled and set to high as well. The geometry and grass LOD or level of detail sliders were set to maximum for an average of 103 FPS. The 1% low was 85 and the 0.1% low was 83. So very consistent here, and we maintain this consistency even when we venture towards town or an enemy camp, which with my semi-auto shotgun here I made very light work of. Spider-Man Remastered 1440p, I should stop saying that for the second time, very high preset with RT on here and left at the default high settings. With TAA as well, we saw 107 FPS on average with a 1% low of 67 and a 0.1% low of 59. Swinging through the city certainly felt very smooth here, and I was pretty happy with the experience at 2560 by 1440 when using the 4070 Super in pairing with my more modest CPU of choice. In the UK these can be picked up for like £130 I think at CEX, so if you're questioning whether or not you could pair one of these with a higher end card, you certainly could, I think, especially as you'll be gaming at higher resolutions. Starfield up next, 1440p. Third time I've said that and said I should stop. High settings. Now by default DLSS or some sort of upscaling will turn on. It's usually FSR2, but I turned this off to maintain 100% res scale, and we saw 73 frames per second. As I mentioned before in another test, I did also play some games with my i9 in the system, and while the average didn't improve that much, it was the percentile lows that really benefited from a better processor. But you're still going to be seeing similar averages with this card in pairing with a more mid-range or modest CPU. And Starfield here, I know it's not the most popular game at this point in time, but it still is a good one to test in my opinion. Next up we have Grand Theft Auto 5. This is older, but it's still in the Steam Top 100 charts at the time of recording. 1440p here, of course, with the highest settings and FXAA. We can enable MSAA if we wish, but here I felt that FXAA was fine, especially with the higher native resolution. We saw 137 with a 1% low of 104 and a 0.1% low of 92. For The Last of Us, I went with the high preset, and the only thing I changed as a personal preference again was depth of field and motion blur, which were both turned off. Here we saw 92 FPS on average with a 1% low of 70 and a 0.1% low of 42. This game looks absolutely fantastic, and it will vary quite a bit in performance depending on where you are and whether or not you're inside or outside of buildings. I like to test this area just after the woods level because it seems to be a little more demanding than some of the earlier stages, so it gives you a good idea of what to expect. Another game I've added back to the benchmarks is Forza Horizon 5. Thanks to my new fast internet, it only took about 15-20 minutes to download, so I thought I'd include this one yet again. Here, the game actually defaulted to the Extreme preset, and I enabled TAA just to eliminate some of those jagged edges. We saw 141 frames per second with a 1% low of 120 and a 0.1% figure of 116, so a nice average overall with some consistent frame times there too. Nothing to speak of in terms of stutter or frame dips. A very nice result all round. Now when it comes to Kingdom Come Deliverance, this is an older game, but it has an ultra high graphics preset which comes with a warning that it's intended for future hardware. Now back when this came out in, I want to say 2018, it was pretty difficult to run on even the top tier cards of the time, so I'm thinking like Vega 64, GTX 1080 Ti, cars like that. But now, thanks to the advancement in graphics card technologies, of course, we can play with the ultra high preset and the HD textures on for an average of 91. So still not necessarily as high as some of you may expect, and there were still a few drops in those more graphically demanding zones, but overall it's nice to see I can finally play this one at 1440p with at least 60 FPS. I haven't experienced many graphics cards that can do this, and it's still a very intensive graphical preset indeed. You still get that warning, and rightly so. Now this is an RTX card, of course, so it was only right to include Quake II RTX at 1440p. I've said it again, the highest settings and TAA we were seeing 85. This is also quite demanding, especially when we maintain 100% resolution scaling, though it can be adjusted and dropped at the click of a button, so you can drop down to like 95-90% as you're playing if you want to. The frame times were also quite consistent, and this one looks really good. I do enjoy the lighting and water effects here, and it's a good one to play if you really want to push your brand new RTX card and see what it can do at high resolutions and settings. Now when Mafia Definitive Edition came out a couple of years ago, I was really impressed by the visuals because it's essentially a remake of the original game, which itself, when it came out, also looked pretty good. Here it runs with almost 150 FPS with the highest settings. In game, these are just high settings. 1% low was 107 and the 0.1% low was 79. So all in all, it was a decent experience, and I included this one in the benchmarks because it is one of my favourite games and I still think it looks really nice. Next up we have the finals. Now with these online competitive titles, you are better off using lower settings to maximise your frame rates. When playing online, it is of course important to get as many frames as possible, but I thought we'd push the card and see what we could do when we turn things right up. So with the Epic preset and RTX set to dynamic high, we were still seeing 116 frames per second as part of our combo here, so not too bad. There are also some areas of the game which look really nice in terms of the lighting and stuff as well, so nice to take advantage of the features if we can. Counter-Strike 2 is another one. Just like all these multiplayer games, you're best off choosing a lower resolution maybe, or certainly lower settings for online competitive play. Here though, with the very high preset and anti-aliasing turned off, we saw 300 FPS as an average. The 1% low was 142 and the 0.1% low was 91. It doesn't really matter what settings I choose because I'm a terrible player either way. As you can see by this footage, it wasn't 5 seconds before I was out the graphics menu that I got wiped out. I don't think it was even 0.5 of a second. I got totally destroyed, as is usually the case with Counter-Strike 2. Apex Legends now, the highest settings here and spot shadow detail turned off. The only reason I turned this off is because I got a warning that it might be a bit problematic even with a 12GB graphics card, which this of course is. I also removed the 144 FPS default cap in Steam, so we saw 261 overall with a 1% low of 194 and a 0.1% low of 151. I think the game still caps at about 300. We did hit that occasionally. Surprisingly, I actually managed to take out a few enemy players in Apex Legends, which doesn't happen very often, but I managed to capture the moment on camera, so to speak. So yeah, I have proof. I'm usually absolutely terrible at this game, so this was a nice surprise here. And as you can tell by the gameplay, once again the card is being pretty much fully utilised. Now when it comes to Fortnite, the Epic preset with Nanite and Lumen is best reserved for showing off or experiencing some pretty fancy visuals that you probably otherwise wouldn't see due to choosing more competitive visual settings. Here though, we saw a very nice 69 FPS with everything turned up, apart from hardware ray tracing, which was off. 1% low here was 44 and the 0.1% low was 36. Again, I don't really recommend playing with these settings because we can certainly get far higher frame rates even with the high preset, but there we go. Battlefield 1 now, this is older. This takes me back to, 2016 I think. Now I believe this has a 200 FPS cap. When I switched to DX12 mode, it ran quite poorly with quite a few stutters here and there, so I just stuck with DX11 and somehow we averaged 199, not quite 200. There were still a couple of drops I noticed. This one still looks absolutely fantastic, and as we're driving apparently into nothing through this intense sandstorm, I'm surprised to see how well the visuals have held up in 2024. I mean, this is still a fantastic game to look at and play, and it's still very popular according to the Steam hardware survey too. So I thought I'd throw this back into the benchmark roster today to see how well an older yet still visually impressive game does with this card. Next up, it's Warzone, the Extreme preset here. The only thing I turned off, as I usually do, was depth of field, which, along with motion blur, usually finds itself turned off as well. The average frame rate here was 140 FPS, the 1% low was 100, and the 0.1% low was 68. I'm not going to spend too much time on Warzone here because it was probably about 5 seconds after I took this bit of footage that I got wiped out by an enemy player, as is usually the case. But there we go. Runs very nicely, even when we turn things right up, in pairing with our Ryzen 5. To finalise, we should include some DLSS frame generation benchmarks with ray tracing enabled as well, because those are features that you may want to choose if you have an RTX card. And here, when we select a lower native resolution and enable DLSS frame gen, it does provide some really decent frame rates as well as some very nice visuals. So we'll start with Cyberpunk 1080p RT Ultra preset DLSS frame gen for an average of 124 FPS here. The 1% low was 79 and the 0.1% low was 50. To finalise, we have The Witcher 3 with RT Ultra and DLSS frame generation, 119 here. I'm surprised at how good this actually looks, this next gen version of the game. Even at the standard Ultra preset, it looks fantastic, but RT Ultra is like a whole nother level. It really does look very impressive, and with frame gen enabled, it helps us to maintain higher frame rates, or DLSS frame gen frame rates anyway. So 119 was the average figure, with a 1% low of 94 and a 0.1% low of 71. Now overall, I've been very impressed with the Palit card, and it's nice to see that it does run quite well even as part of a more modest system. So if you have something like this and you're wondering whether or not you should just upgrade your GPU while keeping everything else as it is, sort of splashing out in a way, it's nice to know that you can do so if you plan on gaming at 1440p. This card in particular, the JetStream OC from Palit, has maintained decent temperatures and stayed surprisingly quiet throughout, but then again, with a cooler this large, I'm not surprised, and this is definitely one to consider if you are after a 4070 Super. But as always, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and hopefully I'll see you all again very soon.